Emily Schmitt, Administration for Children and Families. A photo of Emily is shown. Emily begins speaking as her name and the logo for the Administration for Children and Families transitions in from the left.
My name is Emily Schmitt, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. Welcome to the final plenary and final session of the Virtual Research and Evaluation Conference on Self-Sufficiency 2020. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of you for your attendance at the 20th REX. As you know, this has been our first fully virtual REX, and we appreciate the patience you showed both before and during the conference as we worked to convert nearly all of our content into this new format. Thank you for discovering the ins and outs of a virtual conference alongside all of us at OPRE. I hope that you have enjoyed the last 2 weeks and found them to be a time of productive conversation and learning. We aimed to share evidence and insights on both enduring and timely topics, from employment and training strategies to implementing the Evidence Act, human services response and recovery during COVID-19, the role of equity in evaluation policy, and more. OPRE aims to build evidence to improve the lives of children and families, and we hope that what you have learned over the past 2 weeks will help you to do just that. And we look forward to seeing you at our next biennial conference in 2022, and I hope to see you there in person. I have a few final announcements and housekeeping points before we move on to our final plenary session. The conference evaluation is available online. Today, you should receive a link to complete the evaluation in your email inbox. We really do take conference feedback seriously, so I hope that you will take the time to let us know your thoughts. Conference presentations are available in each individual session's resource tab within the virtual conference venue. You can also send a message to the email address found throughout the program book if you would like to request a presentation. The virtual conference venue will continue to be open for the next few months, and videos of the sessions will be available for on-demand viewing. If you have colleagues who are unable to attend, they are still able to register and view session videos on demand. And of course, you can also catch up with any sessions that you may have missed. After that, videos of all breakout and plenary sessions will be available indefinitely on the ACF YouTube channel and the REX website. Even though the REX is over, we hope you'll stay connected with OPRE. In the virtual venue and on the back of your program book, you can find listed a variety of ways to keep in touch with us. You can find us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. You can sign up to receive OPRE News, which is our biweekly newsletter. And all of these are ways to learn about our publications, grant announcements, upcoming events, and more. You may have noticed that some of these are new ways to keep up with us. OPRE has recently joined LinkedIn and Instagram, and we especially encourage you to follow us on each of those platforms if you don't already. You can also keep up with us by visiting the REX and OPRE websites, and I want to point you in the direction of 2 new features on the OPRE website. We recently launched the OPRE Insights blog as a new way to share what we're doing and thinking at OPRE. You can find the blog from the OPRE homepage. While you're there, you can also navigate to our new Multimedia Center, where you can find videos, visualizations, and more. Finally, I want to extend some well-deserved thank yous. Thank you to all of the conference presenters who set aside significant time in their schedules for recording and otherwise preparing for their sessions, and were flexible and adaptable with our changing format. Thank you. Thank you to our logistics contractor, Impact International, who has done an amazing job at coordinating this conference. We are very grateful for your expert assistance with all of the conference logistics, especially as we navigated this new format together. Our virtual conference platform was designed and hosted by Leading Authorities, Inc. We could not have made this work virtually without them. And a big thank you to our OPRE REX team, led by Victoria Kabak and Amelia Popham, and also including Lauren Deutsch, Marie Lawrence, Gabrielle Newell, Catherine McKinney, Lisa Zingman, Elaine Carpenter, and Selma Call. It takes a tremendous amount of work to pull off this conference, and they did a fantastic job. And I want to thank them again for their resilience and adaptability to our changing circumstances. And thank you again to all of you for taking part in this virtual REX 2020. It is now my pleasure to introduce our final plenary session, featuring OPRE's Pathways to Work Evidence Clearinghouse. The Clearinghouse is a congressionally mandated evidence review that systematically evaluates and summarizes the evidence of effectiveness of interventions that aim to improve employment outcomes, reduce employment challenges, and support self-sufficiency for low-income populations. The plenary will feature a range of perspectives on the development and functionality of the Clearinghouse. I hope you enjoy.
A photo is shown of a woman wearing an orange vest and holding a notepad while she looks into large tubs on rows of shelving. The text on top of the photo reads, Pathways to Work Evidence Clearinghouse, linking evidence to practice. OPRE launches the Pathways to Work Evidence Clearinghouse. Thursday, October 22nd, 2020. The logos for OPRE and Mathematica are seen at the top of the slide. Diana McCallum from Mathematica speaks.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session, Linking Evidence to Practice. OPRE launches the Pathways to Work Evidence Clearinghouse, which is part of the track Evaluating Social Programs, Building Evidence, and Using Data. My name is Diana McCallum, and I'm the Project Director of the Pathways Clearinghouse, and I'm a Senior Researcher at Mathematica. And I primarily lead engagement with Pathways Clearinghouse stakeholders, including direct employment service providers, TANF administrators, researchers, and policymakers. And I have a little over 10 years of experience managing systematic review efforts. I'm very excited to be moderating this important session and introducing you to the Pathways Clearinghouse, which launched in July of this year. And we're so grateful to have found that you have found time to join us for RECS in this year's unique format. Even though we aren't able to meet in person this year, we're so happy to bring our presenters and audience together to hear about the latest research and work being done in this field. So you're encouraged to engage with OPRE and your fellow conference attendees on social media. OPRE is sharing conference content on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Please follow OPRE on these platforms to share your reactions, and don't forget to use the RECS 2020 hashtag to be a part of the conversation. In addition to social media engagement, you'll also have the opportunity to ask questions of today's presenters. So please feel free to submit your questions or comments into the Q&A chat box. And once all presenters have finished their presentations, Kim Klum, our Q&A moderator, will pose many of these questions to the panelists on your behalf. And just for my final announcement, I wanted to mention that this is the final session for Virtual RECS 2020, so thank you for joining us. Right. So now that some of the housekeeping is done, let's turn to our agenda. So we'll start today's presentation with panelist introductions, and then we'll go over an overview and some background on the Pathways Clearinghouse. Then there'll be a website demonstration that gives you a sense of how to navigate the site, and we'll transition to our presentation with panelists. And finally, we'll close with participant Q&A.
Slide title, Panelists. Photos of the 6 panelists are shown. From left are Diana McCallum, Dana Rotz, Claire DeSalvo, Ella Gifford-Hawkins, Harry Holzer, and Kimberly Klum.
So I'm very pleased to introduce you to our panel today. Our first speaker is Dana Rotz, who is a senior researcher at Mathematica and principal investigator for the Pathways to Work Evidence Clearinghouse. And she has over a decade of experience evaluating policies and programs for working families with low incomes. She has also worked on several other systematic review efforts and has leadership positions on the Department of Labor's Clearinghouse for Labor Evaluation and Research and the Institute of Education Sciences What Works Clearinghouse. So next, leading our website demo will be Claire DeSalvo. And Claire is a social science research analyst with Business Strategy Consultants, providing research support for OPRE. And her broad portfolio of work aims to build rigorous evidence to reduce poverty, promote self-sufficiency, and improve the well-being of families with low incomes. Ms. DeSalvo is particularly interested in interventions designed to improve employment outcomes for individuals that are struggling with substance abuse and our mental health disorders. Next, our first panelist is Ella Gifford Hawkins, who is a Pathways Clearinghouse TANF expert and stakeholder. Ella has assisted Larimer County families to help them move toward enhanced economic stability and to ensure that she's really been integral in ensuring that Pathways is responsive to the needs of employment service providers. Our second discussant is Harry Holzer, and Harry is the John Lafarge Jr. S.J. Professor of Public Policy at Georgetown University, and a senior fellow at Brookings and an institute fellow at the American Institute for Research in Washington, D.C. He is a former chief economist for the U.S. Department of Labor and former professor of economics at Michigan State University. And when we begin our Q&A, we'll also be joined by Kimberly Klum. And Dr. Klum is a senior science research analyst at OPRE and the project officer for the Pathways Clearinghouse. All right, now I'll turn the presentation over to Dana, who will provide an overview of the Pathways Clearinghouse.
Slide title, Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2017. Detailed text of the act is read. Dana Rotz is seen in a video thumbnail on the right.
Thanks, Diana. I'm really excited to be able to give some background today on the Pathways Clearinghouse. So the Pathways to Work Clearinghouse began through the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2017. That act directs HHS to create a database of projects, which we refer to as interventions, that have used a proven or promising approach to move welfare recipients into work. The clearinghouse was required to rely on information from independent, rigorous evaluations, and interventions needed to be categorized by their evidence of effectiveness. That is, whether they were supported or more research is needed. HHS was required to establish criteria for each of those categories of evidence of effectiveness, and HHS was asked to draw from other federal efforts to identify and publicize effective interventions. Finally, HHS needed to create a public database of the findings. And thus, the Pathways to Work Clearinghouse was born to fulfill this directive.
Slide title, Goals of the Pathways Clearinghouse. The 4 key goals, conduct, rate, develop, and promote, are shown in boxes with detailed text explained by Dana.
The Pathways to Work Evidence Clearinghouse is a user-friendly website that has been designed to meet the needs of TANF administrators and other practitioners and can support the use of evidence-based practices. The Pathways Clearinghouse has 4 key goals. The first goal is to conduct a systematic review of the impact evaluation literature on employment and training-focused interventions for individuals who have low incomes. This review needs to be both transparent and comprehensive. The next goal is to rate those interventions according to pre-specified criteria to determine if the programs demonstrate evidence of effectiveness in improving outcomes. Interventions are rated as well supported, supported, not supported, mixed support, insufficient evidence to assess support, or no evidence to assess support. Interventions receive effectiveness ratings within multiple outcome domains. Specifically, we are interested in the impacts of employment interventions on increasing employment and earnings, reducing public benefit receipt, and increasing education and training. The third goal of the clearinghouse is to present the information on a high-quality, user-friendly website that presents the review's findings and provides additional materials to make it easy for users to navigate. In addition to information about interventions, the site will also have syntheses about different approaches that show effectiveness, and there are videos. Last but not least, an active goal of the Pathways Clearinghouse is to promote the website and ensure that key stakeholders, including everyone listening today, are aware of the website and its usefulness. Throughout the project, obtaining stakeholder input to inform each of these goals is an important guiding principle for the Clearinghouse. We want the Pathways Clearinghouse to be informed by the wisdom, insight, and guidance of end users. We've held various expert and stakeholder meetings to obtain input on the scope of the review and the content and features of the website. We welcome your further feedback today.
Slide title: Research targeted by the review. 3 sections titled Population, Time Period, and Setting are shown left to right with brief text in boxes next to each title that Dana discusses.
Based on the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2017, the Pathways Clearinghouse focuses on interventions designed to improve family self-sufficiency through employment and training services. The Pathways Clearinghouse focuses on interventions for low-income individuals, including but not limited to TANF recipients. The scope is also limited based on the time period and setting. Research must have been released in 1990 or later. Of course, for TANF, we know that welfare reform was legislated in 1996 and enacted in states shortly thereafter. So those dates are relevant. But we went back a bit further in time as well, all the way back to 1990, to present a complete review of the recent literature. And the setting, for now, we focus on research conducted in the United States and Canada only. The Pathways Clearinghouse is connected to several other federal systematic review efforts. Firstly, it builds on the Employment Strategies for Low-Income Workers Evidence Review, or ESER. ESER, also an initiative of OPRE, like the Clearinghouse, really is the predecessor to the Pathways Clearinghouse and had a very similar scope to Pathways. The Pathways Clearinghouse also has scope in common with DOL's Clearinghouse for Labor Evaluation and Research and the Department of Education's What Works Clearinghouse. However, there are differences. Whereas the Pathways Clearinghouse really focuses on interventions to help low-income workers succeed in the labor market, DOL's CLEAR focuses on a much wider variety of labor research, including programs for low-income workers, but also including a diverse array of other programs based on that clearinghouse's needs and goals. The What Works Clearinghouse similarly includes research across a wide variety of topic areas. It focuses on educational interventions for individuals, for students, all the way from pre-kindergarten and early childhood education through to post-secondary education.
Slide title: Key definitions.
So while there is some overlap in the clearinghouses, there are important differences, and all 3 clearinghouses summarize research in different ways to fulfill their different goals. Moving on to some key definitions for the Pathways Clearinghouse. I want to introduce these definitions to set the stage for our broader discussion. So first, an intervention. An intervention is a specific bundle of services or policies implemented in a given context. For the Pathways Clearinghouse, interventions are defined based on the services offered to the intervention group but not offered to the comparison group. 2 studies examine the same intervention only if the same services were offered in both cases. In some cases, the Pathways Clearinghouse would consider 2 studies to examine different interventions, even if they considered the same services, if the study populations were very different and would have had access to very different sets of services in the absence of the evaluation. For example, TANF recipients and individuals re-entering their communities from prison might receive the same services as part of an intervention. But those 2 groups are very different, and they have very differently available services elsewhere in their community. So the contrast examined by the studies might be different. And in particular, the comparison group for those 2 studies might receive different things. Thus, we would consider 2 studies examining those services for those 2 populations to potentially examine different interventions. We also define a study as an analysis of a distinct implementation of an intervention. And a finding summarizes the effect of an intervention on an outcome measure related to employment, earnings, public benefit receipt, education, or training. It is the smallest element that we review and to which we give a study quality by finding rating. The direction of the finding might be favorable or unfavorable. We also categorize whether findings are statistically significant, that is, unlikely to have occurred by chance, and based on their size, as either small or moderate to large.
Slide title: Key definitions continued.
There are 4 central groups of outcomes of interest for the Pathways Clearinghouse that we report on and summarize the information on for each intervention. We're interested in employment, earnings, public benefit receipt, and educational attainment. For employment, earnings, and public benefit receipt, we'll report on outcomes that are both short and long-term. For each intervention, each set of outcomes gets an effectiveness rating. The ratings are well supported, the highest rating, which is similar to an evidence-based rating, and requires that there are 2 independent studies showing evidence of positive effects of an intervention. Supported, which requires a single study to show evidence of positive effects with no countervailing evidence. Not supported, mixed support, which occurs when some findings show evidence of favorable effects and some findings show evidence of unfavorable effects. Insufficient evidence to assess support, and no evidence to assess support.
Slide title, Finding Research for Review. A series of shapes from left to right outline the process from scope to targeted research, to potential manuscripts, to eligible manuscripts, to eligible studies.
This diagram displays our process for identifying research for review. For the launch of the Pathways Clearinghouse this summer, the team prioritized reviewing, firstly, research previously reviewed under ESER, the predecessor to the Pathways Clearinghouse that I mentioned before, and also the most recent other studies identified as eligible for the review. We identified a large set of potential manuscripts, trained screeners, then applied a set of 7 eligibility criteria to identify the manuscripts that we wanted to review. To be eligible, a study had to have been conducted in 1990 or later, conducted in the US. It had to assess effectiveness using quantitative methods. It had to examine an intervention serving people with low incomes. It had to examine an intervention with a primary aim of improving employment and earnings. It had to examine an intervention serving individual job seekers in a specific context. And finally, the study had to articulate the details on the services provided by the intervention. As the clearinghouse progresses and matures, it will continue to review research remaining within its existing scope, including newly published research not originally identified for the review.
Slide title, Assessing Research. A flowchart moves left to right to show how eligible studies move from the review process to intervention groups and are then given an effectiveness rating of well supported, supported, not supported, mixed support, insufficient evidence, and no evidence.
For each eligible study, Pathways Clearinghouse reviewers assess the quality of evidence at both the finding and study levels. For eligible studies, we capture information on intervention characteristics and the study design. A central goal of the study review is to assess the strength of a study's design, that is, the risk that the estimates of causal effects are biased, and assign the study the most appropriate study quality rating. The Pathways Clearinghouse currently reviews research using 2 eligible designs, randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, and comparison group QEDs. Because the Pathways Clearinghouse seeks to move beyond reviewing individual studies and toward creating a repository of interventions with rigorous evidence of effectiveness, once we review studies, we group them into interventions if the same services are offered in multiple studies. Finally, we aggregate information from across studies to determine an intervention's effectiveness rating within each of our outcome domains.
Slide title, Total Reviews, Statistics Listed.
So the Pathways Clearinghouse team has been pretty busy to date. We've screened over 5,000 manuscripts. Of those, we've identified 346 manuscripts, including eligible research. We've completed 216 study reviews with more on the way very soon. And those 216 studies have included examinations of 161 interventions. Of those 161 interventions, just less than half have at least one supported rating across outcome domains. So what that means is just less than half of the studies that we have examined show evidence of producing favorable outcomes in at least some outcome domain.
Slide title, Future Products, Synthesis Briefs, synthesis reports, and special topics reports.
We also have several products in the pipeline that we'll be posting on the website in the coming months. We'll be conducting synthesis briefs. These will help address what we know about different approaches and service types that are used across employment programs that have been reviewed for Pathways. We'll also produce synthesis reports, which will describe the extent of evidence on employment-focused programs. And then finally, we're working on producing special topics reports, which will address pressing questions that emerge in conducting the review and consider the larger issue of how evidence is built in the field. So now we'll move on to the website demonstration. Claire?
Great. Thanks so much, Dana. So just to briefly reintroduce myself before I turn to the demo, my name is Claire DeSalvo, and I work with the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation within the Administration for Children and Families. And I want to say, we are so lucky at OPRE to have been able to partner with an incredible team of folks at Mathematica to roll out the Pathways to Work Evidence Clearinghouse. So I want to emphasize that while I have the honor of demoing the website today, you should know that they are the folks that have actually carried out this work. I also want to acknowledge my colleague, Kim Klum, who's the project officer for this effort and has led this initiative since its inception. We wouldn't be here today without Kim's leadership, and I'm really glad that she's going to be joining us for the Q&A after the panel. So now I'm going to share my screen.
The home page of the website is shown. The web page is comprised of a banner at the top with the Pathways to Work logo, and to the right are links to sections titled Find Interventions That Work, Other Pathways Resources, About, and Help. Below the banner is an image of a woman wearing a hard hat in an industrial setting. Just below the image is an icon of a person wearing a mask with text that reads, View interventions that are currently supporting individuals remotely during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Here we are at the Pathways to Work Evidence Clearinghouse homepage. And a few things that I want to point out about the homepage before we actually run a search for interventions. First, the website address, it's pathwaystowork.acf.hhs.gov. Second, if you scroll down on this webpage and look under Reviewed to Date, you can see the number of interventions and studies that are currently included in the Pathways Clearinghouse. So as Dana said, the team has reviewed a total of 216 separate studies to date, and together those studies characterize a total of 161 interventions. And those are the interventions that are currently included in the Pathways Clearinghouse. This is based on quite a comprehensive search, but we will be updating the studies and the interventions in the database on a regular basis moving forward. And lastly, I just want to point out here on the homepage, this dark blue bar. If you click on this link, you can see a list of interventions that we're aware of that are currently supporting individuals remotely during COVID-19. So that may be of interest to some of you. Okay, so now I want to walk through an example of a search that a user might carry out on the website in order to introduce you to some of its key features. And for the purposes of this example, I want you to imagine that you are interested in what interventions have been shown to increase earnings for young adults with low incomes who are seeking employment. So maybe you are a program provider that works with this population, or you're a policymaker trying to figure out what approaches are effective for young adults. You come to the Pathways to Work Evidence Clearinghouse website, and you're going to go to the Find Interventions That Work search page.
The page has a banner at the top titled Find Interventions That Work. Below the banner, on the left, is a box with the 6 effectiveness ratings. Below this box are filters for sorting by intervention name or characteristic, filtering for favorable outcomes, and filtering to show similar populations or services. A text box below these allows for filtering by date range. At right, results of the search will show.
So on this page, you'll see a key on the upper left-hand side here, And this key shows the icons that Dana walked through that we use on the site to characterize the effectiveness of each intervention as well-supported, supported, mixed support, not supported, insufficient evidence, or no evidence for achieving impacts in a given outcome domain. You're going to scroll down here, and when you scroll down along the left, you can see 3 filters that will allow you to fine-tune your search so that you can get the results that you're looking for. And we're going to start by selecting the outcomes that we want to improve.
Claire clicks on the text, Select Outcomes You Want to Improve, to expand the box with filtering options.
So let's say we're interested, as I said, in interventions that increase earnings. We're going to check increase earnings here. Then we'll scroll down. It says select characteristics that describe your clients, or it might be just the population we're interested in. We're going to choose young adults, ages 16 to 24. And finally, if you wanted to even further fine-tune your search, you could select specific services that the intervention that you're interested in should provide. But let's just say we're agnostic. We just want to know what works. We're going to leave that one open. So you scroll back up and hit apply. Okay, and here are the results for this search. So the site is displaying interventions 1 through 6 of 6. So there are 6 hits, 6 interventions in the Pathways Clearinghouse database that meet your criteria. And just to orient you to this page, I want to walk through the first row here in this table, the first intervention that has popped up. So this intervention is called Broadened Horizons, Brighter Futures, and it was assessed as supported for increasing earnings, supported for increasing employment, not supported for decreasing benefit receipts, and there was insufficient evidence to assess whether or not it was supported for increasing education and training. You can also see here that it served a population of young adults with disabilities, and there's a list of services that were provided by this intervention. So as you're scrolling down and looking at these 6 interventions, you'll probably notice that 2 of the 6, Broadened Horizons, Brighten Futures, and another one here, Transition Works, served a population of young adults with disabilities. And let's say you're interested in a more general population. So you're going to focus on the remaining interventions on this list. We're going to leave Job Corps to the side because it's a little wonky. So we're going to focus on the last 3 interventions on this list: Europe, the Young Adult Internship Program, and Youth Build, which all serve a general population of young adults. So you are going to click in this column.
The far right column has checkboxes for selecting individual results. Scrolling back to the top of the page is the Compare Selected button.
This is to use our Compare feature and compare these 3 interventions, and you're going to click Compare Selected. And that brings you to this page, which I just love. So I'm going to linger here for a little bit. This is our intervention comparison page. So the table at the top allows you to compare the 3 interventions. You can see a brief description of each intervention, the populations that were targeted, the services provided, the setting, and the year that the evaluation began. And then if you scroll down, you will see 4 tables, one for each outcome domain that we focus on with the Pathways Clearinghouse. And you will see for each table the rating that we've given the intervention in that domain, as well as the direction of the finding, whether it was favorable or unfavorable, and a characterization of the magnitude of the impact.
The Increase Earnings table has 4 columns. The first column has 3 rows for the short-term, long-term, and very long-term impact. The 3 interventions, Year Up, Young Adult Internship Program, and Youth Build, are listed in the next 3 columns with their effectiveness ratings shown for each row.
So let's walk through this table, and we're going to focus on long-term earnings, right? So how did these 3 interventions do to improve long-term earnings for the population of young adults that they were serving. So the first thing that you'll notice is that 2 of the 3 interventions, Year Up and Youth Build, were assessed as supported for improving long-term earnings. The third one, the Young Adult Internship Program, was assessed as insufficient evidence to assess support. And the next thing you'll see is this second arrow, which tells you the direction of the finding. So all 3 of these programs achieved favorable findings in this domain. So you might be wondering, well, why wasn't the Young Adult Internship Program also assessed as supported? And that's because the impact that it achieved was not statistically significant. So we're going to focus then on the remaining 2, Youth Build and Year Up. And I want to talk for a minute. And both of these, as I said, are assessed as supported, which means that we have some evidence that these interventions improve long-term earnings. So looking at this table also lets you understand the difference between the magnitude of the impact that Youth Build achieved and the magnitude of the impact that Year Up achieved. And this is really cool, I think. So we wanted users to be able to compare the magnitude of the impacts of these interventions in an easy to understand way. So what we did was we calculated standardized effect sizes for each of these interventions, and then we mapped these effect sizes onto the distribution of outcomes in a representative reference sample. In this case, the distribution of outcomes for adults with low earnings potential in the 2019 current population survey. And doing this allows you to compare the magnitude of the impacts to each other in an apples to apples way, and in a way that a lay user can intuitively understand. So looking at this, we see that Youth Build achieved an impact, an increase in long-term earnings that was comparable to about $1,400 per year in 2018 dollars, whereas Year Up achieved an impact that was comparable to about $6,800 per year in 2018 dollars. And at this point, you're probably saying, wow, that is a really big impact for Year Up. So you probably click on Year Up to learn more about the Year Up intervention. So to briefly orient you to this page, our intervention description page, we have a 1-sentence description of the goal of the intervention at the top of the page. You can see an icon here, which indicates that the program is currently offering some services remotely in response to COVID-19. There's a longer description of the program itself. We have a table which shows the effectiveness ratings and effects in each of the domains that we examine. It also lists the effect in standard deviations. And then if you scroll down, we have a lot of detail that you can dig into about this program. So we have the organizations that implemented the intervention, the populations that were served, much more detail about the services that were implemented, the service intensity, the comparison conditions, staffing, fidelity, the funding source, cost information. There's a lot there that you can dig into. And finally, at the bottom of this page, you can see the studies that we reviewed for this intervention. You can click here to see these studies.
At the bottom of the page is a link, View Studies for this intervention.
And I should note that the way I think about this site is sort of like an onion, where there's layers going in further. Most people probably aren't going to make it all the way to the study page, but those that are researchers or are research savvy, in other words, those of you who are watching this panel, this may be of interest to you. And you'll see if you come to this page that there's 2 studies that we assessed related to Year Up. The first we assessed as low study quality, and the second we assessed as high study quality. Let's click on that one. And that brings us to our study page. On the study page, you can see details about the study design, the impact findings, including the measure, the timing, the comparison and intervention group mean, and so on. A breakdown of the demographics of the study sample, details about the implementation of the intervention. And you can even click on hyperlinks that take you to the reports themselves, reporting study findings. So with that, I'm going to go back to our homepage. And I just want to encourage you all to, after this presentation and our Q&A, go to the website and spend a few minutes playing around with it. It's really the best way to learn what it has to offer and what it can do for you. Also, when you're on the site, I encourage you to sign up for our email distribution list so that you will get updates as new content is added to the site.
On the right side of the homepage below the main image is a text box to sign up for the email distribution list.
Well, thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our next panelist, Ella Gifford-Hawkins, who's one of the key stakeholders that has informed the development of the Pathways Clearinghouse during its construction. Thanks.
Ella Gifford-Hawkins is shown full screen, transitioning to a slide titled Overview, with Ella shown to the right.
So thank you, Claire. When I was first invited to sit in on the clearinghouse, I was in a panel presentation and was first introduced to the concept of the clearinghouse. What I loved about the idea is from the very beginning, OPRE invited practitioners to give feedback on the clearinghouse. And the different ways that we were involved besides the panels is we had some on-site meetings with researchers, practitioners, OPRE staff, Mathematica staff, and we had some robust conversations about how best to inform the clearinghouse so it was most useful to both researchers and practitioners. So I remember one of the experiences, besides the really great conversations, was actually getting on the site and testing it, whether it was to search for something, find out how easy was it for me to navigate the system, what did I like, what didn't I like, what was awkward to me. All of those pieces were taken into consideration with the construction of the clearinghouse, because most importantly, if a clearinghouse is going to be effective, you have to navigate it somewhat easily. Practitioners, and I'm sure researchers alike, are very busy. So when you use a clearinghouse for information, it needs to be effective for you. It needs to be something that makes sense to you. So all of that was built into the clearinghouse. And we had the meetings together where we could have conversations between researchers and practitioners about what made sense to each of us. And I think it's the best product when both researchers and practitioners can impact how something is designed, and that it works for both of us, and that we both have the ability to say what's important to us. I am a big fan of utilizing research as a practitioner, and because in my field, in TANF, you have 5 years to work with a family. It's important that each intervention that you provide is as impactful as it can be. So when we sat down and we gave feedback, what then happened is the clearinghouse took that feedback and would modify the clearinghouse based on our feedback. And then we get to look at it again and do the same thing over and over again. When we couldn't meet in person, then we met virtually, and we were able to have great discussions that way, and then continue the process of providing feedback and getting feedback from others who were also introduced to it, and continue to build a site that was more robust. So through that process, what was most impressive to me is how the clearinghouse responded to some of the most minute details of what was important to us. So for me, language is critical. I have been fortunate when I've received technical assistance from researchers that they try to understand our language. I will tell you it's a little more challenging sometimes for me to understand theirs. But we found this common ground about how do you communicate the information in a way that it actually can be applied in a way that's concrete and helpful to those of us who are in the field. It also has to be easy to use. You don't want to spend all your time trying to figure out how to use the clearinghouse because then it becomes frustrating, and then I believe that a lot of people abandon sites when it becomes too difficult to use the information. So we're very clear that it needed to be easy to use, find information in a way that made sense to us. And then it needed to also be visually appealing. It had to have a human factor to it. It had to be engaging. And the Clearinghouse responded to all of those pieces. The information has to be helpful in a way that for a practitioner, you can apply it to everyday work. So what does that mean for us? When we started looking at the information available, practitioners get down to the nitty-gritty work of, we're implementers. What would it mean for me to implement a concept, an intervention? I want to know the details. What is it going to cost me in terms of time, staff, salaries, if I have to contract others, supportive services. So when you see the implementation details, that's because we're practical, we have to get work done. We're often compressed for time because as we're doing these things, we continue to serve those people who are part of the monthly or daily caseloads that we have. We have frontline staff who are extremely busy between serving people and completing data entry. So to be able to look at implementation details gave us a better scope of what does it really entail to try out a different intervention. And practitioners are thirsty for that kind of knowledge. We're constantly trying to improve the services offered to the families that we serve. So it's critical that the information makes sense to us. And the implementation details, I think, is one of the things that is most important on the Clearinghouse. May I have the next slide, please? So the other part is, how can this be helpful to my fellow practitioners in the field? There are study findings or comparisons. So if you want to know how something works, you can search for that on the Clearinghouse. And as Claire demonstrated, you can compare those different practices and you get the information in a way that makes sense for you. It goes back to the concept of language, how it was designed, who it was designed for. And we tested it many times. So for those of us who maybe don't have a lot of time but want information, we would search. And then again, it goes back to that feedback loop. This took too long, or this is not intuitive to me. So the Clearinghouse also tried to make it as intuitive as possible for those of us who use this kind of information. And I would tell you that practitioners are hungry for this kind of information. When you serve families who are economically vulnerable, it is incumbent upon us to do the best job possible. So where that information is available and we can begin to improve the services that we offer to these families, it is critical to us in the field. So most of us develop this desire for change because we know that some things are not working. When I first started in the field, I didn't know where to start. So I would look at every site available, look at research papers, but I didn't know what to do with them. What the Clearinghouse offers you is a single place to start where you can get information from different sources, different practitioners, research, and you're allowed to do it in a way that it's convenient, it makes sense to you, and it's easy. It's a lot easier than what I had been doing for years and years and years. And I have 21 years working in TANF. So one of the things as a practitioner that I'm always curious about, what are my colleagues in the field doing? What can I learn from them? It's important that I learn from them because they're in the field, they're doing it. And for me, they have credibility. So I value research, I value it highly. The other part is when they've done something and they've talked about their implementation details, those are pieces that will speak to me. And then I'm informed about what could I try. Some of us are living in areas that are too small maybe to conduct formal research. So we do want to learn from others. And those level of details help us make informed decisions. If you want to try something new, say you have a grant. There are a lot of grants available, but they ask you to do specific interventions or they give you other details. This is a perfect place to start looking, what could you do? What's out there? What information do you need for that grant? Are you prepared to execute what's required in that grant? So you could find the information here. Another thing that I absolutely love about the Clearinghouse is it is evolutionary in nature. So in one of our sessions, I think it was a panel presentation, we were talking about the impacts of COVID-19. When you are in a situation of a pandemic where the world has changed around you, you have to work virtually, all the rules have changed. Sometimes you can't wait for research to try something different. So the idea of using case studies, which are quicker in nature, is something that the Clearinghouse has now started placing on the Clearinghouse. And it is that level of responsiveness to practitioners in the field that I believe makes the Clearinghouse something extremely useful to those of us who want to continue to offer great services to the families that we serve. And that's what I have for today. I'm going to turn it over to Harry. Thank you.
Harry Holzer is shown in a video thumbnail at right.
Thank you, Ella. Thank you to my friends at Mathematica and at ACF for including me in this conversation today. So I'm supposed to provide the perspective of researchers and how we will view the Clearinghouse. I think this will be a very large contribution to researchers, not only in academic research, not only, for instance, when you're writing a review paper on a certain body of literature of what works in an area, what doesn't, or even when every time you write a paper and you have to summarize the literature in your paper before moving on to your own results. This will be very, very helpful for those things. But where it's really helpful, I think, is in that interface between research and policy and practice. Some researchers like me, who have actually spent some time in the federal government and talk a fair amount to federal and state policymakers. And I think this will be very, very helpful because we're often asked, you know, what should we do? We have limited numbers of dollars and we have large problems. We have populations with a great deal of need, as Ella's just described. What should we do next? Now, what's really nice about the Clearinghouse is, and by the way, you know, I think a few of the other clearinghouses have been mentioned, like the one, what works in education. So we have some evidence looking at that for the last 10 or 15 years. That's been enormously helpful. I suspect this one will be as well. But it answers a couple of very important questions that researchers worry about a lot. First of all, what has actually been evaluated and what has not yet been evaluated, at least rigorously. So there's lots of programs and efforts we see out there. You could look at this Clearinghouse and say, geez, this hasn't been evaluated at all. That should go pretty, if the findings and the outcomes look promising, this should go high on the list for the next round of evaluations. And of course, once an evaluation is done, does it look like it works or doesn't work? And very importantly, for whom? Because we know this issue of, you know, different populations are served in different ways. And for instance, a program that works for one particular group, let's say Europe, might not work for a group that's harder to employ and harder to serve. But that information you can glean from this Clearinghouse as well. Because it does talk about which populations are served with which kinds of services provided. And I really like this feature, not only that you can access the studies from different angles, you can focus on the population served, or you can focus on the outcome you want to improve, or exactly which services were provided. So it enables you to organize those 200 plus studies in ways that researchers like to think about those kinds of things. So that's very useful. And I really like the feature that enables you to compare on any given population, like disadvantaged youth, compare across some different approaches and assess what works better, what works worse. And, you know, especially what I think it might be most interesting. So if a policymaker says, what should we spend more money on? You can look at the things that really do seem to work quite clearly. in this realm and suggest those. You could also say this other intervention doesn't work that well. Maybe you should shave some of the resources away from that and reallocate them. But the most interesting place is often, there's a lot of programs that are going to fall in that in-between category, where maybe, out of 4 outcomes that they tried to improve, maybe one of them works. Or maybe it has impacts that aren't quite big enough to be significant, or maybe the impacts don't last. Maybe they fade with time. And there's a lot of programs that fall into that category. And you can wrestle with the question of, what do we try next in that area? Are the results promising enough that maybe if you provided some additional supports for participants in the program, the outcomes would look better? Or maybe if you gave a higher dosage of the treatment or a longer duration of the treatment, you might get positive results. To me, one of the interesting areas, just to give an example, is the whole literature on transitional jobs, which has been in some ways very interesting, also very frustrating to folks like me, because on the one hand, during the duration of the program, the impacts on employment are really quite large, but fairly soon after the transitional jobs end, the employment impacts seem to fade away, but not in every case, not for every population. 1 or 2 of them seem to reduce recidivism, others don't. So you're often wrestling with where the impacts are mixed and somewhat ambiguous. What's the most sensible place to go next? And I think being able to put together groups of studies that have targeted a certain population or that have used a certain approach, like transitional jobs, I think this will help us come up with answers to those questions. And I think that's very helpful. Now, I do have one beef with the clearinghouse, and again, my friends in Mathematica and ACF have heard this before, but I think it's important to mention. It does use what I consider to be a quite strict and maybe even quite rigid criterion for what's considered success. The program has to achieve 95% confidence, or a particular finding or measured impact has to have 95% confidence, which means the p-value has to be 0.05 or lower. That's very frustrating to me, because what if it's 0.06 or 0.07 in a certain intervention? What if you only have 93% confidence or 94%? The program is listed as a failure on that particular dimension. So I find that a little frustrating. I argued, and I understand the people who were doing this, I think, agreed with me partially, but didn't have the freedom to change that. I would, at a minimum, have had p-values of 0.10 or higher. 90% confidence remains very high. And in fact, in my own work, I sometimes, when I'm writing up results, I will sometimes even go down to 80%, which is a T of 1.28 in a 2-tailed test. I apologize for the wonkiness there. But those kinds of decisions have an enormous impact on what appears to work and what doesn't in this limited context. So I understand that was something that Mathematica folks couldn't do differently. It was something I found frustrating. And I do want to mention just some other limitations. So I've talked about, I think there's a lot of pluses with the clearinghouse. I do want to mention a few limitations from the point of view of a researcher who often talks to practitioners or policymakers, some things that are missing that would have made this even more positive. Let me be clear, I don't regard this as a criticism of folks who worked on the clearinghouse, because again, with limited time and limited budgets, you can't do everything. And I'm particularly pleased that they plan to keep working on this and incorporating things that are not quite there yet. So I think that's very good. But I just want to mention some of the things that are limitations in the current version of this. So I think these things are high priorities for additional work for the folks that are going to keep working on this. So first of all, it focuses very heavily on programs that have been run out of HHS and to a lesser extent out of DOL. That makes perfect sense, right? Who's paying for the product and what body of research and populations you want to focus on. There's much less on things like impacts in the world of education. For instance, Title IV money on Pell Grants and things like that are often used by poor people to help get more skills and more training. Now you might say, well, why should we even bother with the Department of Education? You might say it already has its own clearinghouse. We shouldn't look at that. But the reason to worry about the Department of Education reminds me of the old statement attributed to Willie Sutton, the bank robber. people ask him, why do you rob banks? And he said, because that's where the money is. Well, frankly, if you want to help people enhance their training, the Higher Ed Act, Title IV of the Higher Ed Act is where the money is. Pell Grants get vastly more funding than virtually all of the employment and training programs the federal government put together. So there are certain things that didn't make it into Clearinghouse, and just people need to be aware of that when they're reviewing, and maybe they should look at the What Works Clearinghouse and Education at the same time. But secondly, it focuses on what earlier was called interventions, or what many of us call programs, rather than policies and practices that are widely in place. So for instance, there's policies like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is often used for folks that have a fair amount of attachment to the labor market, but may not be good candidates for moving up based on the research. So policies like that, of course, are not included here. Or certain kinds of practices that are very standard. So again, if you go back to, for instance, community colleges and all the certificate programs that exist, both for credit and not for credit, which are often places that low-income people go to get some skill enhancement. We don't really learn anything on those programs, like the sector-based, and I know some sector-based training programs are included here, but those dimensions of policy and practice that are not really programs per se get left out as well. Again, that's not a fatal flaw. Researchers can just keep that in mind. A larger missing element to me is the cost per participant of the intervention, because what economists like to do is cost-benefit analysis. We have the benefits measured here, we have the impacts measured here, but we don't have any data on costs. I understand that is something that Mathematica will continue to work on and to try to add wherever it can to the information that exists already. But that's very, very important, because there's many places where you get positive impacts, and they look very good, very encouraging, like in the Year Up example we saw before, but the cost of the program is very high, and it may not pass a full cost-benefit analysis at this point. So the cost information, and are you talking about the marginal cost per participant for a program that already exists? Are you talking about the average cost? Those are very important questions. Number 4, this doesn't really tell us anything about the scale. Now, it does tell you about the number of participants, the sample size, but it doesn't really tell us anything about have these interventions been tried at scale. And that's, for a researcher who talks to policymakers, well, that's one of the great frustrations, that we often have these little gems that seem to work very well. We have no idea if you tried them, which are really scalable and what that would look like. So maybe Mathematica can think about that and think about some way to indicate the scale. Again, it's not the same thing as sample size in a study. Which interventions have actually been scaled up? For instance, which TANF employment programs have achieved scale in certain states. And I think that's important for the conversation as well. And then finally, it doesn't tell us much about other kinds of rigorous interventions. In the academic world, RCTs, random assignment studies, are considered, what everyone calls them, the gold standard. But there's another body of tools that we sometimes refer to as natural experiments, or quasi-experiments, and most of those, a lot of those have not been included, I believe, in the clearinghouse. And of course, when you use those, academics always argue, is it a credible natural experiment or not? Is it a credible quasi-experiment? And those are often murky answers that make it very hard to include those kinds of studies in these analyses. But again, those are some of the things that I think are limitations in its current form, and I would like to see Mathematica and ACF continue to, wherever possible, to add some information on those dimensions of programs and policy to do so. Having said that, let me close just with a very clear statement. I think this will be enormously useful to anyone that either are doing pure academic research or, as I said, in that interface between research and policy and practice. I think this will get a lot of use. And again, if you can combine this information with other data, other information about costs or scale or things of that nature, that's when I think this will be really, really helpful. So I congratulate Mathematica and ACF for pulling this off, for putting a ton of work into this. And I look forward to seeing it used a lot in research and in practice in the years ahead. Thank you.
Diana McCallum from Mathematica is shown full screen.
So thanks, everyone. I just wanted to take a moment to thank all of our panelists for, giving us a really strong background in the Pathways Clearinghouse and for walking through a clear demonstration and providing some insight into the different ways that you can navigate the site. And of course, our panelists, Ella and Harry, that served as discussants and, gave us some insight and things to consider for the future. So thank you for that. We wanted to leave the audience with a few bits of information about how to stay connected with the Pathways Clearinghouse. You can follow at Mathematica Now or at OPRE_ACF on social media, and that way you'll get the latest updates, and you can always look for the hashtag Pathways to Work to search for the latest content. As Claire mentioned, you can also join, and we encourage you to join the Pathways to Work Clearinghouse email list. You can do that on the homepage by just subscribing and entering your email. And of course, we encourage you to visit the website and engage with the website and use some of the searches and tools. You could do that by going to pathwaystowork.acf.hhs.gov. And if any of you have any other specific questions that you want to reach out to the Pathways specifically, you can email us at the email address listed here. You can also feel free to contact both Dana Rotz and Claire DeSalvo with specific questions that you might have. All right, and now we want to transition to the participant Q&A portion. Thank you.
The view transitions to the 5 panelists, along with Kim Klum from OPRE.
Hi, as Diana mentioned, I'm Kim Klum, a senior social science analyst at OPRE, and along with Claire DeSalvo, I manage the Pathways project. Thank you so much, Diana, Dana, and Claire for providing such a helpful and engaging overview of the Pathways Clearinghouse. And thank you to Ella and Harry for such a rich commentary and perspective on the relevance of pathways to your worlds, the worlds of practice and research, and helping us hone in on particular aspects of pathways usage that are relevant in those worlds. In his comments, Harry mentioned that one area for possible expansion for pathways would be the inclusion of information about the cost of these interventions. Ella mentioned that one of the valuable aspects of pathways is that it has continued to evolve even over its short lifespan. And with that in mind, I want to start off by turning to Claire and asking her to share a little bit about how Pathways is evolving to include some cost information.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked because I did want to share kind of a friendly amendment to one of the limitations that Harry noted regarding cost. And by the way, Harry, your comments were very well taken, and thank you for those. Listening to your comments and Ella's comments, I was just reminded again of how grateful we are to have feedback from the two of you as members of our stakeholder group, as well as the feedback from the other members of the group, inform the ongoing development of the clearinghouse. And, while of course the clearinghouse can't be all things to all people, and we think it adds a lot of value as it currently stands, it is a living resource, and we're going to continue to refine and improve it over time. But the point I wanted to make about cost was that we do include some cost information in the clearinghouse currently, with more to come. So our plan is to include cost information when available for all interventions that have a supported rating in at least one outcome domain, which is about half of all of the interventions in the clearinghouse. And that information is going to be available on the intervention description page. Right now, cost information such as the per participant cost of a program is available for 10 interventions in the clearinghouse, but we're working on adding it for the other interventions that I mentioned with a supported outcome. And we intend to roll out that information to add it to the website through early spring of next year. Now, a couple quick caveats about that cost information. So first, we draw the cost information that is included in the clearinghouse directly from the studies that we review. So if the study authors did not conduct a cost analysis, then we don't report cost information. And second, we don't assess the quality of the cost study itself. We simply report the findings. So cost analyses can vary in terms of their quality and the methods that they use to characterize costs. So just, users keep that in mind as you look at that information. But that said, we absolutely agree that cost information is a key piece of the puzzle. And as we update the information on the website and the field gets better at reporting cost information, we're going to prioritize continuing to share that.
Thank you so much for that, Claire. So this is the question and answer portion of our presentation, and we're very eager to hear questions from folks who've been watching the presentation. We have one question, which is a kind of technical question that I'll ask for you, Dana, which is someone asked, how are long-term earnings defined? What number of months and years is the threshold for long-term?
Sure. So we classify outcomes into 3 groups based on time period: short-term, long-term, and very long-term. Short-term is 18 months or less. Long-term is 19 months to 5 years. And then very long-term are outcomes measured more than 5 years after participants in the study's intervention group are first offered services.
Great. Okay. In the meantime, we've also had, thanks so much for that, Dana. In the meantime, we've had a few other questions come in. Let's see. Are there any plans in the future to expand the outcomes tracked or evaluated beyond the 4 discussed: employment, earnings, benefit receipt, and education? And I'm actually I'll say a little bit about that because I think this is really a question for OPRE, since we are kind of the decision makers here. Not without our significant expert input from our Mathematica colleagues, and then I'll ask Claire to make any additions. But yeah, we've had really robust conversations about this. We have not made any decisions to include any additional outcomes at this point, but we definitely have listened to colleagues in the field. Harry mentioned that the What Works Clearinghouse. There's also CLEAR, and we. As we've had lots of conversation with our federal colleagues as well as other experts in the field to kind of think about the different outcomes that can be kind of cross-relevant among those different kinds of clearinghouses, and that are still very important for being able to kind of consider the long-term self-sufficiency kind of goals and objectives that we have for the participants that we're aiming for. And Claire, do you want to add anything to that? Would you like to?
Nope. That was good.
Okay. Okay, great. So this is a long question, so let me just quickly see what it says here. Oh, this is an interesting question. And actually, I'm going to kind of broaden the question. So I'll read the question as it is, but I'm going to slightly broaden it to something that we had also talked about kind of internally with the team as well, which is, so this question is, Harry raises a great point. Some vulnerable populations have multiple needs and risk factors that could be addressed with programs and interventions, and policymakers, stakeholders may want information from multiple clearinghouses in order to determine the best path forward with their limited resources. Do HHS folks have any thoughts about potential collaboration across federal clearinghouses? And I'm going to broaden that to kind of say that we do actually collaborate to some extent already with our federal partners who run these clearinghouses. And I think maybe Diana, would you like to say something about that first? And then Dana, you might like to add.
Sure, I can say a little bit about that. I think as a starting point, we did sort of look at the standards that are used across other clearinghouses. So that is one point of coordination to make sure that we're sort of relying on the same standards for determining what makes the study high quality. So that is one thing that is consistent between Pathways and thinking about the other clearinghouses that are mentioned, like the What Works Clearinghouse and CLEAR. Was there more you wanted to add to that, Dana?
Yeah, I would just add that, we do try to coordinate with the other clearinghouses that have overlapping content, including, as Diana mentioned, and mostly the What Works Clearinghouse and the Clearinghouse for Labor Evaluation and Research are clear. Those are the two with the biggest overlaps. We do have meetings between the teams to make sure that one of us isn't saying something that's going against what another clearinghouse is saying. We've also discussed how these clearinghouses are really quite complementary with each other, and how they, what the different clearinghouses bring to the table based on their different missions.
Yes, that's really great. And I'll just kind of add just a little bit to that, which is just again to reiterate, as Diana mentioned, when we were standing up Pathways, it was very important to us that we make sure that we kind of had a very good understanding of our federal partners who do this work, and so we brought in also in addition to our colleagues at the Department of Labor, Department of Education, we also had our colleagues at the Department of Justice who run crimesolutions.gov, and we had folks from other evidence reviews at HHS participate as well, because it was very important to us to make sure that both in terms of our technical decisions that we were making, and but also in terms of our scoping decisions, that we were making things that made sense. So we don't want things to be so part of the question is asking, how do you break down the silos in some ways? And I think that, as Dana was saying, we see them as a lot of synergies across the clearinghouses, but we also want to be really certain not to be duplicative. So if you can get information about something that is in the What Works Clearinghouse or in CLEAR, we don't want to be wasting federal efforts and redoing that effort. We want to be kind of building on it and to the best extent possible. Claire, do you want to add anything further? That's okay. Okay. Oh, this is a really useful technical or scope question, I guess, which is, do the evidence-based practice interventions, or do the interventions in the clearinghouse include international studies? And Dana, I'll ask you to talk.
So for now, we've limited the scope of the Pathways Clearinghouse to interventions in the United States and Canada. So we do include any research conducted in Canada, but that would be the only international research that we would include.
Thanks for that, Dana. So Ella, this is a question for you, which I think is a great question and really builds on the kind of comments you already made. But what types of resources or technical assistance do you think would be most helpful to folks like you and others in the field to be able to support your use of interventions from the clearinghouse or from other kind of evidence-based resources?
Well, I would tell you what I found most helpful when I was able to access technical assistance is the level of expertise and knowledge around research and practices that allowed us to follow a structure and implementation kind of plan. So when you're testing out something new, it really helps if you have somebody who knows how to do that and then is able to transfer that knowledge and practice to you. For me and my team, when we were doing this, we got to the point where we were able to run rapid cycle evaluation road tests on our own. But that didn't happen right away. And I can tell you that initially you may feel some trepidation. There may be some fear. People will interpret research and pieces like that with their own definitions. And what technical assistance did for me and my team when we did this is it helped alleviate that fear. It provided structure, a timeline. It made us define what problems we were trying to solve and how we thought we could solve some of those problems. So for those of us who are first stepping into this practice, it really helps to have somebody who has expertise, but who can also learn and speak your language and then help you implement a plan. A plan makes all the difference in the world. And then it also helps your team members, your staff members, acquire a skill set that really transforms your culture, how you approach problems, and how you implement possible solutions.
That's really helpful. I think that's a really, I love getting to hear that perspective. And you're, especially in the work that you've done, you've had a lot of experience in trying to figure out how you kind of also build evidence from the ground up. So it's like, it's a very interesting synergy. You know, here there's evidence coming from the top down and evidence from the ground up. Harry, I want to actually kind of, in some ways, I want to pose a slightly tangential question from that, but related, but this is something I feel like Pathways struggles with a lot, because as I said, when we were building Pathways, we collaborated a lot with other evidence reviews that, for example, HHS oversees, many of which are actually come from a different disciplinary background. So a lot of the other HHS evidence reviews come from fields of medicine, and they come from fields of like developmental psychology or potentially kind of family systems theories, I guess. But they come from disciplines where the information about the intervention is also very much grounded in implementation. Pathways, historically, many of the interventions that we have in Pathways were initially kind of came out of a more your field, labor economics, and which was not heavy on capturing a lot of implementation information. It was a lot more about kind of incentives and disincentives. And that was kind of the idea of human behavior changes in response to incentives and disincentives. So if you capture what the incentives and disincentives are, that's what you need to do. But Harry, I'm kind of curious if you think about, like, from your perspective, from the academic research side, do you think there's a movement in the field to kind of be more considering of these kind of implementation and kind of fidelity issues, things like that?
Very much so. I mean, I think my field is being humbled that, you know, the implementation issues are so important, which is why so often an intervention works at site X, but not at site Y. So I mean, it's foolish at this point for economists or anyone else to believe that that isn't extremely important. And the folks I know at Mathematica or MDRC or other places that work in implementation, it's hugely important. Now, it does raise that interesting question of the fidelity issue and the trade-off between, you know, having very high fidelity to the original model versus in other contexts, whether the fidelity is the most relevant or whether you want to have other, you know, and whether you think of that as a modeling issue or an implementation issue, you know, maybe it's a little bit of both. But yeah, these issues are very important. And many of you remember someone whom I knew and respected at HHS, Michael Wiseman, who was one of the few economists that worry enormously about implementation. And every time we spoke, he would express his frustration that more of our fellow economists didn't worry enough about implementation issues and how important they are for the policy. So absolutely, very important.
Dana, would you want to add anything to that, or is that something you'd be interested in commenting on as well, or am I putting you too much on the spot?
I certainly agree with Harry. I think that this is something that labor economists are lagging in compared to a lot of our colleagues, but something that we're working hard to do better at.
And Kim, if I could just make one point.
Oh, please, yes.
Related to that. I mean, I think Claire touched on this earlier, but we are really, you know, trying to put forward for those interventions that have at least one supported outcome, we're really trying to put forward the implementation information that is available so that folks can see, you know, details on the organization that implemented the program, for example, or, you know, specifics of the services and the service duration. And I think another one that's come up across the experts is whether there's a measure of fidelity available. And a lot of times there isn't, but these are the things that we're putting out in the forefront because we know they're important for folks. And we do hope researchers will, you know, sort of look at what we're listing under our implementation details and really be attuned to what, you know, what we have heard is important, and we'll start reporting more on some of those details.
And then to add one little,
go ahead.
Sorry, to add one little thing to that, we are working with the information we have on services and intervention duration to conduct some meta-analyses and meta-regressions to try to tease out what that, what the data we have on implementation and the characteristics of implementation mean for impacts and for intervention effectiveness. So that is something that I'll just tease as coming soon to the Pathways Clearinghouse.
Thank you for that. That was really helpful. So Diane, I'm going to pose this question to you. Are the interventions focused in any way on the social determinants of health?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think, the interventions that we focus on are, our primary starting point is that they're employment-focused interventions, and they do include a wide range in there. There are certainly, and we're starting to capture more information so that people can see sort of the different categories of interventions. But I think there are some that, focus on, in addition to specific self-sufficiency characteristics, broader, that the interventions pay broader attention to other challenges that participants may be experiencing. But I don't know if others have anything to add to that. I mean, there are a wide range of models included that maybe are more sort of health and person focused, but.
Okay. Go ahead, Claire, were you going to say something?
Well, so I actually had a comment I wanted to make in regard to the previous question, but I was on mute, so I wasn't able to make it. So we can just go back in time, just a few moments. In regard to the implementation details that Diana was discussing, all of that juicy detail on the intervention description page, I just wanted to add another reason why I think it's so important is because, just to give an example, so I used to work in the family strengthening field. I was working on evidence-based teen pregnancy prevention programs. And those programs look very different from programs in the economic self-sufficiency space. So in teen pregnancy prevention, you have packaged programs that are sold by developers. They often come with some sort of fidelity tool. And even then, of course, there can be incredible variance in terms of the quality of implementation, but it's very clear that it's one discrete packaged thing that you are describing when you talk about the program. And in this space, we've talked a lot about the fact that these interventions are sometimes not as clearly defined, right? So they are sometimes a collection of diverse services or small p policy or practice changes implemented in a given context. And so I think for that reason, it's even more important to have all of that rich implementation detail for those interventions that have been assessed as supported. Yeah.
That's great, Claire, thanks. There have been two questions that have been kind of related to the question that we had earlier, which was the question about whether or not we had plans to include additional outcomes. And so someone else followed up with something specifically like, what about if you not just capturing additional outcomes, but maybe subsets that could be searched within the outcomes, like food security, housing stability. And I guess what I was thinking when I first read that question was that, Dana, I was thinking of, we do actually capture information on additional outcomes. We don't rate them, but I wondered if you might just explain a little bit about how we do kind of go through what we do capture about the studies that we are in the clearinghouse.
In terms of the outcomes or
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we capture two sets of outcomes. The first is the set of outcomes that we actually look at findings for, and we rate according to the quality of the research. And for those, we capture, the impacts, the intervention comparison group means, the standard deviation, the data source, the sample size, all of those details. Then there's all the other outcomes that we don't capture. But for those, we do catalog what the authors are analyzing in terms of domains. So we'll capture that they also looked at housing stability, or we'll note that they also looked at, recidivism. For example, if a study was focused on a reentering population. And so all of those domains are listed on the study page so that someone can see what other outcomes a study has looked at.
Thanks, that was very helpful, Dana. And then I think this might be the final question, although I did want to give Ella and Harry in particular a chance to kind of add any final comments if they'd like, but just this final question, and I'll ask it of you, Claire. So you did a very helpful and lively tour through the website through a very particular kind of search, but what would you kind of lift up as some of the kind of other ways in which people might want to be interacting with the search features? Like, what are some other search features that you'd like to maybe emphasize? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute, Claire.
Thank you, Kim. So the example that I used to walk people through the site was based on a very specific question that a user was trying to answer, right? But there are also ways to use the site to explore interventions with kind of a broader scope. So for example, you can go to the Find Interventions That Work page and not even run a tailored search, right? You can just see all the interventions that are in the clearinghouse. Right now, they're organized in alphabetical order. We're having conversations about perhaps arranging them in a different way moving forward, but right now they're in alphabetical order. You can look through all of them, right? Or you can ask a question that, that's relevant to many of our stakeholders, TANF administrators, right? You might want to ask, well, what interventions are in the clearinghouse that have been implemented with individuals who are on cash assistance, right? And so in that case, you go to the filter box and you choose cash assistance recipients for your filter, but you don't put any other filters on, and you'll see all of those interventions. So those are just a few kind of ideas for how you may want to play with the information in the website using the Find Interventions That Work tool. And then we have other information on the website as well that we encourage you to check out. So there's video recordings. You can watch webinars that we've done. Those are posted to the website. We'll have a series of videos that is forthcoming that walks you through how to use the website. We have case studies of programs that have not yet been rigorously evaluated, but that we think are interesting or noteworthy in some way, and you'll be able to view those. So I'll just emphasize again that either right now, as soon as we wrap up this presentation, or sometime tomorrow when you have a free, 5 minutes, go on the website and play around with it. It's really the best way to learn kind of what it can do for you.
Thanks, Claire. That was so great. So we only have a couple minutes left, but I really would love to give Ella and Harry, do you have any, the last word, if you have any final thoughts or final comments that you'd like to make, please, would love to hear them.
Go ahead, Harry.
Sorry.
What I would say is that it's a unique opportunity to get information that really is a collaboration among researchers, practitioners. It's quick. I know that folks want to improve services. I know that we have been through some really tough times. And this is a quick way to access information that can be helpful to you to improve the services you're offering to families that you serve.
And I'll just say, as a researcher who cares a lot about policy and practice in the real world, kudos to the ACF team, kudos to Mathematica for creating a very useful product in that realm. I think it's very good work. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much again, Diana, Dana, Claire, and especially Ella and Harry. As Diana had mentioned, and as Claire reiterated, please go to the website and investigate Pathways for yourself. It's at pathways.acf.hhs.gov. Once you're on the website, as Diana said, you can sign up to be on the email list and be kept abreast of upcoming events and updates about new Pathways resources. Thank you so much to the audience for being with us for this final presentation, final plenary, final presentation of REX 2020. This was the final session, and please join us again in 2 years at REX 2022.
The final slide shows the logo for REX 2020 and OPRE. REX is the acronym for the Research and Evaluation Conference on Self-Sufficiency.